Conflicts that Shaped Pharaonic Egypt. Lecture 4. The Old Kingdom, the Pyramid Age.
Egyptologists usually consider the first and second dynasties to be the early dynastic period, a time of the organization of the Egyptian administration and the earliest of the Pharaonic state's foreign conquests in Nubia to the south and in Syria-Palestine. With the third dynasty, the Archaic period comes to an end, and the end of the third dynasty really ushers in the High Old Kingdom, what some would call the Old Kingdom proper, dynasties 4 to 6. The most visible marker of dynasties 3 through 6 is the pyramid. Discussions of the pyramid dominate discussions of the Old Kingdom. This is understandable, but we don't always take away from a study of the pyramid all the information that we might gain. The Old Kingdom is a time of highly organized bureaucracy, with the king's nuclear family in charge of many, if not most, of the major governmental functions. This is the case through the end of the fourth dynasty. The bureaucracy then begins to expand exponentially, and as the Old Kingdom progresses, the king's family simply cannot be big enough to hold all these jobs. The provinces become vastly more important than they were earlier. The local administrative divisions, the states or nomes of Egypt, as we call them, that's N-O-M-E-S, these local provinces, these local administrative divisions become much more important. Local administrators can no longer be part of the king's family exclusively. The local administrators can't even all just spend most of their time around the capital city as they were wont to do in the early Old Kingdom. They increasingly must live in their local areas. And this ultimately, with other factors, spells the end to the highly complex and incredibly centralized state that was Old Kingdom Egypt. One of the first deeds of the unifiers of Egypt, following the final subjugation of opposition to Upper Egyptian domination in the Delta, was not simply the creation of the myth, the historic background of a pre-dynastic state for the Lower Egyptians. It was also the construction of a symbolically located capital city. Apparently, the first rulers, Narmer himself no doubt, began the construction of an administrative center at a city we call Memphis, which is the Hellenized version of the name of a late Old Kingdom pyramid complex in the area, Men-Nefer, enduring of beauty. Memphis is located on the west bank of the Nile, just southwest of modern Cairo. This new capital city was a new administrative position for the former Dynasty 0 rulers who moved from their capital city of Abydos in the south to this new site in order to be at the juncture of Upper and Lower Egypt. Ancient Memphis is located at the point where the Nile Delta ends and the Nile Valley begins, at the apex of the Delta. In fact, one of the terms for the city of Memphis was Mechat Tawi, the balance of the two lands, the balance as the balancing plates of Upper and Lower Egypt. The most spectacular achievements of the Old Kingdom are certainly the great pyramid fields to the west of ancient Memphis. Foremost amongst them, Giza, Saqqara, Abu Sir, and others of which most have not heard. This emphasis on the pyramids often obscures other aspects of Old Kingdom life and achievement. The Old Kingdom rulers were active in Sinai and southern Syria-Palestine, in mining and in military expeditions, as well as expeditions into Nubia to the south. They built on a colossal scale, and not only pyramids. In a little dry river valley, an arroyo southeast of ancient Memphis, behind modern Helwan, a little valley called the Wadi Hof, a 4th dynasty ruler began the construction of an enormous stone cofferdam that would, had it been completed, held the largest water reservoir prior to the Roman period. The Old Kingdom Egyptians built, and they built on a massive scale. We should look at the pyramids, but we should not look at them simply as enormous, single, monumental stone constructions. No pyramid is anything more than one element in a very complex mortuary group. And what we can learn from the pyramids will tell us a great deal about the development of Egyptian society and the development of Egyptian religion. Ultimately, understanding the pyramids, the use of the pyramid, and the economic significance of the pyramid will show us how Egypt develops in the centuries following the end of the Old Kingdom. Now, the first burials of pharaohs in Egypt, and I might add that the term pharaoh derives from the ancient Egyptian para'ah, meaning the great house or the mansion. It's a way of referring to the ruler, just as one might say the White House says when speaking of the President of the United States. This term pharaoh technically does not really seem to exist in the Old Kingdom, but I have been using it and will no doubt continue to use it essentially synonymously with the term for Egyptian king, Egyptian ruler. The initial burials of the first rulers of Pharaonic Egypt, the rulers of Dynasty 0, were located in a wadi to the west of Abydos. We can see these tombs and follow their progression and development from Dynasty 0 through the First Dynasty. They consist of increasingly complex subterranean chambers with some sort of a superstructure over them, perhaps a mound that may symbolize for the Egyptians the so-called mound of creation. One of the ways the Egyptians envisaged the origin of the world is to liken the origin of the world to the beginning of the new year following the receding inundation waters of the Nile. Once a year, beginning around the time of the longest day, the waters of the Nile would begin to rise. And eventually, if it were a good Nile flood, this flood would overflow the banks of the Nile itself, with the water spreading as a thin sheet out between the Jebel escarpments, the various temples and cities emerging, just peeking above these waters on their little hills and mounds, protected perhaps to some extent by enormous mud brick enclosure walls. As the Nile waters receded, leaving behind them this thick, black, alluvial soil, inundating the land and fertilizing the land for the next year's crops, the temples themselves, the cities, the places of human habitation would seem to emerge as though they were rising up out of these receding waters. So for the Egyptians, one way of envisaging, one way of rationalizing visually and conceptually in the human world the idea of the origin of the cosmos and the origin of the ordered world and the ordered universe was to see it as emerging out of this great watery void. That is why, incidentally, later Egyptian temples often have column capitals in the form of papyrus or other swampy plants. An Egyptian temple is ultimately, even though it's out in the desert perhaps, and even though it's made entirely of stone perhaps, it is in fact a watery, aquatic environment. It is an image of the world emerging from the beginning of time. As you go back into an Egyptian temple, you go through a series of open courts, ultimately into a covered area, and you will notice that the floor will begin to rise and the ceiling will begin to descend. You are not only going back into the aquatic world of the beginning of time, but ultimately you're going back from before the beginning of time, back to the singularity when space didn't exist, before creation emerged out of what the Egyptians envisage as a great watery void called Noon. And creation begins as a small bubble of order, a bubble inhabited by Shu, the god of luminous space, of light and air. And this bubble expands over time. So in an Egyptian temple, when you're back in the Holy of Holies with that low ceiling, high floor, it's all dark and enclosed. That is the first moment of space. And as you emerge from the temple, you go out, ultimately with the sky above you in an open court, out through courts and colonnades of water plants as the waters begin to recede and the world begins to enlarge, until as you emerge from the temple, you emerge into the world in its greatest, most fully formed fashion of now. As you go in, you go from now back to then, and vice versa as you emerge. The early Egyptian burials of rulers appear to have had some sort of mound over them, almost certainly evoking this mound of creation. Now, interestingly, by the time of the First Dynasty, a royal burial does not simply include the underground chambers for the body and burial goods, and ultimately a statue cult as well, with a mound symbolizing the mound of creation and the hope for regeneration of the body and regeneration of the soul. A tomb of the First Dynasty rulers of Egypt also includes a separate but associated enormous rectangular mud brick enclosure built at the edge of the desert, not out in the wadi with the tomb, but built at the edge of the desert, at that point where the red land and the black land come together, just out in the red land, at that point where you see them coming together, but built of the black bricks of the alluvial soil. So a great image of the mixing of the red land and the black land. Black bricks on red soil at the point where the red soil meets the black soil. What went on in these big mud brick enclosures is probably what we see on that great monumental mace head of Narmer from Hierakonpolis. The king would have sat enthroned on a platform beneath some sort of a pavilion, watching all sorts of ritual events. The Narmer mace head shows the parading of divine images past the king. It shows prisoners and the running of a ritual run, the king's run, around large objects that look like orange slices, possibly representing the nets that trap the migratory birds out on the edges, the cusps of the ordered world and the outer darkness. Animal sacrifice also occurs. Narmer's mace head at Hierakonpolis shows us a great royal ritual. That sort of royal ritual probably occurred in these enormous mud brick enclosures that are associated with the burials of the kings of Dynasty I. So we get, with the first phase of pharaonic history, we get a burial that is not simply the burial of a ruler, as it was in Dynasty 0, but the burial of a ruler who has extremely important ritual duties to carry out, and apparently death does not get him out of those ritual duties. The early royal tombs, then, consist of a mound over a burial and an associated ritual enclosure where the king would sit. This ultimately, this bipartite royal burial at Abydos for Dynasty I, ultimately, during the Third Dynasty, leads to the creation of the first great monumental stone architecture in Egypt, and the largest up to that time in the world, the creation of the step pyramid complex of King Zoser at Saqqara. The imagery that we can derive from the step pyramid complex of Zoser is incredibly informative. The mud brick enclosures of Dynasty I are oriented north to south. The long walls of the rectangular enclosure are all oriented north-south. Each of the enclosures appears to have a main entrance at the southeast corner and a subsidiary entrance at the northeast corner. Under Zoser, something very interesting is accomplished, and legend has it, ancient Egyptian legend, that this was the brainchild of the architect and all-around proto-Renaissance man Imhotep, vizier of King Zoser. With Zoser at Saqqara in the Step Pyramid complex, we see a combining of the actual burial site, the underground chambers with creation mound superstructure, and the ritual enclosure. The genius of Imhotep, even beyond using stone architecture for everything, is to combine these two elements to make something that is a bit more meaningful whole than its individual elements probably earlier signified to the Egyptians. If you look at the Step Pyramid complex of Zoser at Saqqara, and you compare it to the mace head depictions of Narmer from Hierakonpolis, you see something really quite amazing. The central element on Narmer's mace head in his ritual event is Pharaoh on his great stepped platform. The central object in the Saqqara complex of Zoser is the stepped pyramid. On the mace head of Narmer, the king oversees groups of priests bringing in standards of the gods of Egypt. In the southeastern portion of Zoser's Step Pyramid complex are a series of identically formed stone shrines, apparently representations of what otherwise in real life would have been the semi-permanent wooden and matting-built shrines of Egyptian deities visiting the complex. On the mace head of Narmer, we see a great ritual court for runners with these orange slice objects, these banks around which the people run that may represent these nets out on the edges of the cosmos. And in the Step Pyramid complex of Zoser, in fact, we see 4 of these orange slice shaped running elements, 2 to the north, 2 to the south, in a large open court to the south of the pyramid. Just as on the Narmer mace head, the parading of divine images and the running of ritual runs is important, so in the Zoser complex, the southern portion of the complex is dominated by shrines for deities and a court for running of the great ritual court. On the Narmer mace head, far out in front, far to the right of Narmer himself, is a scene of animal sacrifice and a court bounded by a sinusoidal wall in which we see the sacrificed animals themselves. The northern part of Zoser's Step Pyramid complex at Saqqara is in fact one enormous open court at the northern end of which the inner part of the north wall in the center is a large, enormous altar. This is a place for animal sacrifice. What Imhotep has done is combine the place for ritual activity, the mud brick enclosure wall, which in the early dynastic examples is empty and could actually have been used. Imhotep, for Zoser, has combined that enclosure with the royal burial. Now, rather than a place where these semi-permanent structures could be set up for a ritual and taken down when the ritual was over, now these structures, these semi-permanent structures, are immortalized in stone. Most of the buildings at Saqqara don't have insides. A few do, but most don't. Most have doors that simply give way to stone. There is no inner blank space. It is a great stone hieroglyphic representation of one of these great ritual enclosures. Now, what does this mean about the Step Pyramid itself, then? The Step Pyramid is indeed that, a stepped pyramid. In fact, more than being a stepped pyramid, it is a four-sided stepped platform. It is simultaneously the mound of creation that was built atop the old burial places of the rulers of Dynasty 0 and Dynasty 1, and at the same time the great viewing platform of the king that must have been set up in those early mud brick enclosures and that we see actually in use on the Mace Head of Narmer. Other rulers of the Third Dynasty attempted to reproduce Imhotep's feat. Apparently, some of the Third Dynasty rulers attempted to do it on a much grander scale. Out beyond Zoser's enclosure at Saqqara is the so-called Jisr al-Mudir that would have been a much, much larger enclosure, but it is not completed. All of the step pyramids, Zoser's, the unfinished step pyramid of Horus Sekhemkhet, and all those others that don't seem even to have gotten such a good start as that, are oriented north to south. All of the late archaic Old Kingdom pyramid complexes, those of the Third Dynasty, have a north-south axis like those early enclosures. Those early enclosures have sometimes been termed the fortresses of the gods. With the Fourth Dynasty, many things change. We know we depart now from the archaic period. The bureaucracy is much larger. Writing is much more common in general. Decoration in private tombs is more common. And another thing that happens with the Fourth Dynasty that shows us that we aren't simply imagining this change is that there is a reorientation of royal funerary monuments. And this tells us something more than that the Egyptians simply got tired of building north-south enclosure walls with step pyramids in them. With King Snofru at the beginning of the Fourth Dynasty, the old north-south axis is exchanged for an east-west axis. With a new east-west axis, we leave entirely behind the world of funerary monuments enclosed in a perhaps large but ultimately restrictive north-south enclosure wall. Now the axis of the monument is stretched out tremendously towards the east. Snofru constructed a number of pyramids. He at least finished the pyramid at Meidum, that may have been begun by his predecessor Huni. He constructed two complete pyramids at Dahshur, the so-called Bent Pyramid and the Red Pyramid. He, in addition, constructed a series of small step pyramids up and down the length of the Nile Valley. The abandonment of the north-south axis of the old step pyramids for the new east-west axis coincides with the abandonment of the old step pyramid for what we would call the true smooth-sided pyramid. This is an important point to remember. The step pyramid is not simply the piling up of a smaller mound on a slightly larger mound on a slightly larger mound. Private tombs of the Old Kingdom, for the wealthy, tended to take the form of a low rectangular stone structure that we call by the Arabic name mastaba, or bench, because it reminded some of the early workmen of benches outside their houses. These bench-like stone monuments ultimately derive from copies of divine enclosure walls. They have the same origin as the step pyramid complexes. Sometimes the step pyramid of Zoser and other step pyramids will be qualified as simply a smaller mastaba on top of a bigger mastaba on top of a bigger mastaba, etc. That is not, however, the case. No matter what the architectural knowledge may have been that led to the development of the step pyramid, the ideology behind the step pyramid is one of a royal viewing platform within a great religious enclosure. With the change in orientation from north-south to east-west, we get a change from the step pyramid to the true pyramid itself being a solar monument. One of the great primeval monuments of the solar cult in Egypt, kept at the Temple of the Sun at Heliopolis, now somewhere around modern Cairo airport, was a great stone called the Benben, the reduplicating name meaning the sharp or the pointy stone. We have every reason to believe that the pyramid is an enormous architectural manifestation of the Benben stone. The fact that the southeast corners of the Great Pyramids at Giza line up along a line pointing to Heliopolis indicates that the pyramids themselves as funerary monuments are markers of the setting sun, just as the Benben stone was a marker of the rising sun. At the same time, if we look at Snofru's so-called bent pyramid, whatever architectural problem, whatever load-bearing stresses may have induced the architects to change the angle of that pyramid, it nevertheless has the shape of a very stumpy obelisk, the long, tall, tapering-sided monument with a pyramid at the top that we know as yet another of the ancient Egyptian solar monuments. What this tells us is that the change from a step pyramid at the end of Dynasty 3 to the true pyramid at the beginning of Dynasty 4 spells a very different significance for the royal burial monument. With Dynasty 4, the king is identifying himself more fully with the solar cult. The old cosmic god Horus is still important, but beginning with the 4th dynasty, the sun god Re, and the king as the vicar on earth of the sun god, the king as the incarnation of the sun god on earth, becomes a primary tenet of pharaonic kingship. In the old enclosures of the gods, the primary entrance was on the southeast, with a subsidiary entrance on the northeast. In private tombs, already by the 4th dynasty, the all-around niching that we see in the mud brick architecture of the early divine enclosures, the all-around niching that we see even in Zozer's Saqqara complex, has given way to the survival of only 2 niches, a niche that represents the main door into the old enclosure on the southeast, and a subsidiary niche that represents the subsidiary entrance to the old enclosure at the northeast. These private mastabas develop ultimately a single major focus, which is a type of door or niche on the southeast, at the south end of the east wall. The door at the south end of the east wall in the private mastabas, that final fossilization in those private monuments of the old main entrance into the rectangular north-south divine enclosures, is shaped like a niche, and ultimately it comes to have a stone monument in it, a stela, that ultimately itself develops into a type of door image, a flattened version of an earlier niched door that we call the false door. The niche of the false door, the focus of the private funerary cult, also enters royal architecture during the 4th dynasty. Now, not only is the old north-south enclosure all stretched out east to west, evoking the course of the sun, not only is the old step pyramid platform of the royal review of the visiting gods and rituals turned into an actual marker of the setting sun, but under Khufu, the builder of the Great Pyramid at Giza, a temple at the base of the pyramid has as its back wall an enormous architectural niche, an enormous false door abutting the pyramid itself. Khufu could not tell us. If he had told us in writing, and unfortunately I have to say if he did, no one's ever found it, and I wish he did, but he could not have told us any clearer that he is identifying his cult as a deceased human being with his cult as ruler in the pyramid, all identified with the cult of the sun, the pyramid as the marker of the setting sun. So look at what the Egyptians have done. By shifting the axis of the royal mortuary complex from north-south to east-west, they have said we're now on the solar cycle. By adjusting the main monument so it is no longer a stepped dais for the king, but a pointed perch for the solar bird, the Bennu bird, a marker of the setting sun, now the niche that has developed out of the old southeast entrance to a divine enclosure, the old door that has become the focus of cult in, say, private monuments, the monuments of royal officials, this niche now on a monumental scale is the back wall, the focal wall of the pyramid temple of Khufu. The kings of the fourth dynasty are true sun kings of the old kingdom. This is a break with what goes before, and we see it monumentally preserved in the pyramid complexes of the old kingdom. Now, interestingly enough, the last ruler of the fourth dynasty, a man named Shepseskaf, broke with his predecessors. What Shepseskaf does, or I should say does not do, and what his successors do, show us that the equation of royal and solar cult may have become somewhat disturbing around the cusp of the fourth and the fifth dynasties. Shepseskaf built at South Saqqara, not at Giza, and he did not build a pyramid. He did not even build a step pyramid. He built an enormous monument that essentially is a gigantic version of a royal stone sarcophagus called the Mastabat Pharaon, Pharaoh's mastaba in modern Arabic. The succeeding fifth dynasty rulers of Egypt go back to building pyramids at a different place, Abu Sir. But at the same time, literally a stone's throw away from Abu Sir, these rulers of the early fifth dynasty also build, concomitant to their pyramid complexes, they build solar temple complexes. Shepseskaf breaks with this identification of the royal cult and the solar cult completely. The fifth dynasty goes back to the pre-Shepseskaf fourth dynasty prototypes, but also separate out, those early fifth dynasty rulers separate out to some extent the solar cult by building separate solar temples at Abu Ghurab, right next to Abu Sir. Their pyramid complexes and their solar temples are balanced elements of a whole. We're back to some sort of a dual burial place and ritual complex. After that was put together under the third dynasty, it comes apart again with the beginning of the fifth dynasty. The first ruler of the fifth dynasty, who does not build a solar temple with his pyramid complex, a man named Djedkare, does another thing that tells us that there was some lack of comfort with this total equation in the fourth dynasty of king and son. Djedkare builds a pyramid complex, does not build a solar temple at Abu Ghurab, but he changes the priesthood of his mortuary complex from being priests of the king, from being priests of Djedkare, to being priests of the pyramid, priests of Djedkare's pyramid. They are priests not of him, of his cult, but priests of his cult site. Again, probably a subtle nod to a separation of royal and solar cult, and a change, in fact, that Djedkare made retroactively for some of his predecessors as well. By the time of the fifth dynasty, the capital is increasingly less significant as the place where all of administrative power and all of the great people of the bureaucracy are gathering together all the time. Egypt was divided into 42 nomes, or districts. with levels of administration that exist in local, district, and national levels. Early, almost everyone with power in these areas spent most of their time at the royal residence. They simply had to. So much of the power was in the hands of members of the royal family. And that's not hard to imagine how many people understood and could manage the bureaucracy at this time. During the course of the Old Kingdom, however, Middle Egypt and the Delta see intensified exploitation of agricultural land, particularly in the form of the establishment of pyramid plantations. Upper Egypt is different, and these differences in the areas of Egypt eventually lead us to the three power centers that we see come to the fore at the end of the Old Kingdom. During the Egyptian 5th dynasty, so circa 2500 to 2350 BCE, local administrators, people living in the areas they administered, who were previously satellites of the king in the central administration at the royal residence, began to accumulate power. Under the 5th dynasty ruler Djedkare, we have evidence, in fact, for a number of burial grounds of local officials in the areas they were administering. We see more district administrators entombed in the middle provinces of Egypt. Not everyone is being buried in those great satellite mastabas that cluster city-like around the bases of the pyramids of the 4th dynasty rulers. The districts of Egypt are emphasized in nomarchic titularies of the 5th dynasty. The ones that we find the most prominent in those titularies were probably the most agriculturally wealthy of the nomes. The rulers of the 4th, 5th, and 6th dynasties established funerary domains, or new cities as they're called, associated with the royal mortuary cults. Remember, it took not only a great deal of effort to build the pyramids, it took possibly greater effort to organize, administer, feed, house, and supply the workforce that did the hauling, the priests that did the spiritual work and would ultimately take care of the royal cult after the death of the king and supply those complexes. The setting up of pyramid plantations was one of the economically most significant parts of establishing a pyramid construction site. During the 4th dynasty, most of these pyramid plantations were set up in Middle Egypt. During the 5th and 6th dynasties, we see increasing numbers of them in the southern delta. Apparently, the Egyptians are using the economic necessities of pyramid construction and the necessities of supplying those builders and the ritualists who carry out the activities at the pyramid complexes. The Egyptians are using the necessity of setting up these plantations to build up the agricultural base of Middle Egypt and the southern delta. Almost none of the pyramid plantations are set up in the 8 southernmost districts of Upper Egypt, an area administratively called the Head of the South. That is the area where the Upper Egyptian pre-dynastic cultures are first at home. That is the area where the Nile Valley early became part of the great African Neolithic. That is the area where wealth is best measured in terms of trade, long-distance trade, caravans along the desert roads, access to the gold mining regions of the Eastern Desert and Nubia, but an area agriculturally underdeveloped and agriculturally poor compared to Middle Egypt and Lower Egypt. As local governors began to spend more time in their provinces, both in life and in death, the districts under their control enjoyed greater royal patronage in form of royal plantations following them into the countryside. The governors of the far south were a bit more on their own and increasingly became their own men. By the 6th dynasty, between about 2350 BCE and 2200 BCE, perhaps as a part to secure more personal pharaonic control in the far south, King Pepi I actually established close relations with an important family in Abydos. Plantation-rich Middle Egypt came under the control of the governor of the main tax grain receiving center at Meir in the Upper Egyptian Nome 14. Thebes, modern Luxor, appears to have become the tax collection center for what there was of grain, tax, etc. for the southernmost districts of Egypt. The late Old Kingdom thus saw the establishment of an agriculturally rich Middle Egypt and southern delta, administratively centered economically at Mir, and cultically and royally at Memphis. The uppermost districts of the south, the head of the south, were trade-oriented, with a somewhat loyalist north, Nomes 5 to 8, and a more independent and certainly pugnacious far south, districts 1 to 4. After the end of the 6th dynasty, the ephemeral 7th and 8th dynasties increasingly courted Upper Egyptian support through a series of exemption decrees that we know for the Temple of Coptos in the Upper Egyptian Nome 5. The increasingly weak successors of the Old Kingdom, based at Memphis, increasingly lost control to local governors in Middle Egypt and giving away their power to court the increasingly separatist governors of the far south. Finally, rulers at the city of Heracleopolis, not far from the old grain-collecting center at Mir, between the Nile Valley and the Fayum Oasis, an agriculturally rich area of Middle Egypt, rulers of the city of Heracleopolis finally put an end to the death rattle of the Old Kingdom and began the 9th and 10th dynasties, circa 2200 to 2050 BCE, based at Heracleopolis near the mouth of the Fayum. This period Egyptologists often refer to as a feudal time. The new capital of Heracleopolis is located between the agricultural hub in Upper Egyptian Nome 14 and the administrative center in Memphis. It succeeds the Old Kingdom and controlled Egypt directly up to the southern border of the 5th district of Upper Egypt, the northern border of ancient Thebes, modern Luxor. South of the 5th district, in Thebes, in Mu'alla, in Edfu, in Aswan, in the far south, were a series of egotistical, pugnacious rulers much more interested in quarreling amongst themselves than in their weak professions of loyalty to the weak feudal rulers of the 9th and the 10th dynasties in the north. During the next lecture, we will see how out of the wars of the rulers of the head of the south during the first intermediate period emerges a new vision of a unified Egypt under the leadership of the Theban ruler Mentuhotep II.
This ends Lecture 4. Remember to visit this course's webpage at www.modernscholar.com, where you'll find additional information about the lectures you just heard.